Hey, and welcome to our first PowerPoint for New Mexico history. This is our first week doing this, and so please follow along, pay attention, because there will be a discussion question afterwards that you will need to answer. So follow along and listen carefully as I explain some of the things that we're going to talk about first. So this is just a little intro into what is history and the reasons behind studying history. All right, so this is lesson 1 of chapter 1. Our vocabulary for this week is bias, a one-sided point of view. Now, bias is not the same thing as being prejudiced or racist or anything like that. Bias is actually not anything that is completely negative. Bias is just choosing to have a preference of one thing over another. For example, if I choose one sporting team over another sporting team, then it doesn't mean I don't like the other sporting team. It just means I choose one over the other. That is considered to be bias. Bias can be my favorite color is green. Doesn't mean I don't like red. It's just I prefer green. So that would be a bias. Our next vocabulary term is artifacts. Artifacts are objects people made or used in the past. You can see over here in this picture that these are artifacts. Artifacts can be arrowheads or tools from the past. Sometimes you can find them on the ground, walking around. Sometimes they're in museums or they're in locations that people have already found them. Fossils and things like that. Those are all artifacts. Our next one is oral history. That is spoken history that one person tells to another. For example, if I told you about the history of how my family came to America, I would be telling you in an oral way. I would be telling you by you listening, and that is an oral history account because I don't have it written down anywhere, and it's not in a history book anywhere. The next term is perspective. It is understanding events and people based on the accepted ideas and values of the time period being studied. For example, I can't judge certain people for the way that they acted or the way that they ate or believed or did anything in the past because they lived during a different time than I did. They had different tools. They had different technology. I have to understand that some of the things that are available to me were not available to them, and vice versa. The land was a lot more vast, and there were a lot fewer things to help them. So I can't judge them by how they ate or what they did in their time or as part of their culture. That would be taking a perspective as to learning about the past. All right, our next slide is talking about primary and secondary sources. Now, these are the types of things that how a historian can justify whether a artifact is valuable or it has it holds more merit than other things. So a primary source are first-hand accounts or original objects and documents from the past, like a handmade basket or photographs or newspapers, journals, or letters. So if you have a journal from someone who lived a long time ago, they wrote that themselves. They wrote down everything that happened to them in their own personal imagination is going on the paper. What they saw, what they felt, what they know, they wrote down. That's a first-hand account. Or a letter to someone is a first-hand account. Or even something that is handmade. Like the artifacts on the previous slide, those were handmade. That would be a primary source. Primary means that it came first. It was not something that has been remade. Now our next term there is secondary source. It is a second-hand account, such as a biography, a painting of a picture, historical fiction book. So For example, if I wrote a story about George Washington, even though I studied him and I knew a lot about him, that doesn't make it a first-hand account. I wasn't alive when George Washington was alive. I don't know what he was like. I just wrote about his life from what I studied. That is a biography, and that itself is a second-hand account. Now, an autobiography, if I wrote it about myself, would be a first-hand account, and that would be a primary source. If I painted a picture of George Washington, again, that would be a secondary source, because I am technically not painting a picture of George Washington, because he wouldn't be sitting in front of me. So those are examples of first-hand and second-hand accounts, or primary and secondary sources. Some things like paintings and sculptures and art and music, they can be both primary and secondary. I can paint a picture of a landscape if I'm sitting there looking at it, and that's a primary source. But if I paint a picture of a picture that somebody took, that's a secondary source, because I didn't actually experience that sunset or that picture of that landscape myself. So that would be a secondary source. So if you experience it, you firsthand, then it's a primary source. If you experience it secondhand, like somebody else experienced it and now you're recapturing it, that would be a secondary source. Sometimes it's hard to decipher which one is which, but just remember, if you weren't there and you didn't see it, then it's probably a secondary source. Or if the person that created it wasn't there or didn't see it. So, those are just some quick terms to talk about early on in our first week here. Okay, our next slide is talking about historical thinking. So, historical thinking is when completing a historical research. For example, if we wanted to know if something was a primary source or a secondary source, it is important to ask the 5 W's and the H. Who was involved? What happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did other factors influence people and events? So the who, what, when, where, why, and how come into play when you're talking about historical thinking. You have to ask yourself, if you are thinking about a historical event, maybe we're talking about the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed. Who was involved? Well, the Founding Fathers were involved. What happened? They created a document to base America on, and they all signed it. When did it happen? Well, it happened July 4th, 1776. Where did it happen? It happened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Why did it happen? Well, America was ready to be its own country. So, they created a government idea based off of what they knew about life and liberty, and so they created this document, and they signed it. How did other factors influence people and events? Well, it all started with Britain, and they weren't being very nice. So, it's a kind of a long story, but America was ready. America was ready to be independent. And all those factors leading up to it just played into it. And they led to where we are today. And the Declaration of Independence is one of those significant things that happened in time. So, when we do historical research, we just answered all of those questions. And if we can't answer all those questions, we don't have enough information to make sure that we're answering the question correctly. So, those are some thoughts to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about how history works. The who, what, when, where, why, and how of historical thinking. All right, so that was the last slide for today. And we are going to end our PowerPoint here, but please go to the discussion board and answer your question and respond how you see fit. And I will be looking over your discussion questions later on.